know nothing we can say will console the families and loved ones, but all we can do is tell you all we grieve for you. We hold out our hearts for every one of you. And Donald Trump started off his response to the tragedy very much in this vein. He started off doing the right thing, calling for a moment of silence for the 67 victims of that horrible tragedy over Reagan National Airport. But shortly after that, it went downhill to the point where it became one of the worst moments in the history of the American presidency. I'm not being hyperbolic. One of the great tests of a presidency is that you are the consoler in chief. It is up to you to bring the nation together in the wake of a horrible tragedy. It is up to you to offer to the American people unbiased, non-political facts as they are known, or to explain to the American people the facts are not yet known, but we're going to wait until the facts are in before we jump to any conclusion. Every modern American president has succeeded in this role of comforter, explainer, uniter in chief. Franklin Roosevelt in 1941 did so after the horrific attack on Pearl Harbor.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
Ronald Reagan did so in the wake of the Challenger catastrophe.
I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union. But the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss.
Bill Clinton did so in the wake of the horrific Oklahoma City bombing.
The bombing in Oklahoma City was an attack on innocent children and defenseless citizens. It was an act of cowardice, and it was evil. The United States will not tolerate it, and I will not allow the people of this country to be intimidated by evil cowards.
And of course, George W. Bush did so in the wake of the deadly, destructive 9/11 attacks.
Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America.
These are both Republican and Democratic presidents who have risen to the occasion of a tragedy to show compassion. This was very much of a bipartisan achievement on the part of very different, very diverse presidents. I want to talk to you again about accuracy and bias in the media. Ground News is a website and app that I use that pulls articles from all over the world and organizes them by story. With Ground News, you can compare how different outlets cover the same story, complete with context and visual breakdowns of the sources. You'll see details like their political bias, reliability, reporting practices, and ownership, which is critical. These ratings are created through 3 independent news monitoring organizations. For example, take the story, quote, Congress formally certifies Trump election win, unquote. There are over 600 news sources for this story, with 38% of the bias being from the center. It's also great to see that 73% of these sources are rated as highly factual, and 11% of them are independent sources. Take a look at the bias comparison, which gives you an AI summary for the left, center, and right sources. Examining the headlines further, sources from the right focus on terms like certifies, exhausted Democrats, and Democrats cling, whereas the left headlines focus on terms like a good day for democracy, peacefully, and routine. The blind spot feed highlights news stories that are disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. You know how much I care about combating misleading information. Ground news helps you see through misleading narratives and stay informed without being overwhelmed. So go to ground.news/Allen, ALLAN, or scan this QR code to subscribe. My link saves you 40% on their top tier Vantage plan, which I use to access all their features. That's only $5 a month in a world where news moves fast and the truth is hard to find. It's important to be using Ground News to see the full perspective. Plus, by subscribing, you're directly supporting my work. Donald Trump shattered this tradition, and not in a small way. He, in a sense, exploded it in many different ways. First of all, the investigation had barely begun. We heard from the head of the National Transportation Safety Board, who had originally been appointed to the board by Donald Trump.
We are not going to get into specific facts in this press conference. I want to level set here. We're going to get into our investigative process. As we are able to confirm factual information, we will provide that.
What did Donald Trump do? He speculated. He had no facts. He had no hard information. Nobody did. As the responsible official said, the investigation had barely even begun. There were no answers, and yet Donald Trump speculated about what, in his view, was likely responsible for the tragedy. But that wasn't bad enough. It got much worse. He blamed it on his Democratic opponents and allegedly on their embrace of diversity, equity, and inclusion policies.
The FAA is actively recruiting workers who suffer severe intellectual disabilities, psychiatric problems, and other mental and physical conditions under a diversity and inclusion hiring initiative spelled out on the agency's website. Can you imagine? These are people that are, actually their lives are shortened because of the stress that they have.
The crash happened on his watch, but he had no responsibility for it. The responsibility lay with Barack Obama, who hasn't been president, since the beginning of 2017. He blamed it on his predecessor, and he claimed that it was their DEA policies that, when you use your common sense, in his word, may well have caused the tragedy. He said this without a single hard fact to back it up, and blatantly lied. He said Obama gutted the standards of mental and physical fitness to be an air traffic controller. And then the great Donald Trump came in and vastly elevated the standards. And then Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg, the transportation secretary, put them into the gutter. Use your common sense. If, in fact, Buttigieg and Biden had gutted the standards for being an air traffic controller. We should have had mayhem in the skies for 4 years. In fact, as Buttigieg pointed out, given billions of passengers flying commercial aircrafts throughout the tenure of his secretaryship and the Biden administration, there was not a single fatal air crash. Not one. I'm not saying Trump was responsible, but it is utterly false, irresponsible, demagogic to blame it on your Democratic opponents, even though the record totally belies what you're saying. And there is not a shred of evidence that DEI policies had anything to do with this crash. Trump read us this list of, supposedly horrific disabilities, claiming that under Biden and Buttigieg, such persons became air traffic controllers. Another big lie that had nothing to do with the very rigorous standards of mental and physical fitness. I think it's a year or two, maybe 2 years of training that you have to go through to be an air traffic controller. But it gets worse. Who is he essentially blaming for the crash? Black people, minorities, and women, the supposed unqualified recipients of these DEI programs. And this is consistent with Donald Trump's racism and misogyny that has characterized his entire political career. It's not an accident that he would blame this on women and racial minorities. Finally, what did Donald Trump do upon becoming president? He followed Elon Musk to force out the administrator of the FAA. He fired the head of the Transportation Security Administration. He froze positions in the federal government when, in fact, we're short of air traffic controllers. He put out a memo designed to get federal employees to leave their jobs, again, when we're short of air traffic controllers, and perhaps most egregiously, wiped out the Air Safety Advisory Board, which has made important recommendations over time in a bipartisan, independent way for air safety. Past presidents could have politicized tragedies, but chose not to. Franklin Roosevelt could have blamed Pearl Harbor on Republican isolationists, saying, they led Japan to believe that if they struck a blow against the U.S., we would just fold up and, not go to war. Didn't do that. Bill Clinton could have blamed Oklahoma City on Republicans in Congress, saying they encouraged extremism. Didn't do that. George W. Bush could have blamed the 9/11 tragedy on the alleged lax policies of his predecessors. They didn't do that. I'm not saying if they had done that, it would have been right, but, they could have politicized it, and they did not. That's what makes what Trump did so horrific. I am not going to mimic Donald Trump and speculate about the causes of the crash. But I would say, a lot of churning at the top, a lot of changes in policy, which I outlined, which directly affect the air traffic controllers, would be, and I'm not claiming it is, but would be a much more plausible explanation than this ridiculous attempt to blame it on women and racial minorities through DEI programs. It is true. I don't have the entire list of those he fired, but he fired the only woman commander of one of the American service branches, the woman commander of the Coast Guard. He fired something like a dozen career prosecutors who were involved in the very legitimate prosecution of Donald Trump, who were just doing their job. Those are just some examples. And yes, as I mentioned, he also fired the head of TSA, creating a lot of turmoil within the government. And let me also say, he fired a dozen or more inspectors general who are supposed to be independent and who are one of the few guardrails we have against a dictatorial president. I'm just flabbergasted why we would do that. Of course, he takes no responsibility for it, wants to put the blame on everyone else, which is Trump's MO, not just throughout his political career, but throughout his career as a businessman. You know, when he went bankrupt, it was all the fault of someone else, had nothing to do with him. I guess what he gets out of it, he wants chaos. Says, I was elected to cause chaos, to shake things up. And he wants to undermine the federal bureaucracy so that he can put in his own loyalists. As I said, you know, he has appointed arguably the least meritorious set of high officials in the history of the country. He's not focused on merit. He's created affirmative action for Trump loyalists. But why, you know, he would do this for those on basic safety, I'm not sure he targeted officials responsible for safety. I think that was part of his broader attack on the federal bureaucracy.